They said I'd die alone. They said it like a prediction, a certainty whispered over the crusts of cake at my 70th birthday, when the candles smoked in front of me and my daughter smiled too tightly to be kind. I remember the way she said it, almost tenderly, as if warning me of the weather. "You don't want to end up alone in that old house, Mother." I laughed, because what else could I do? I'd spent my whole life being told what I didn't want, what I couldn't manage, what wasn't proper for a woman of my age. But that night, when they left, and the dishes were drying on the rack, I sat in the silence of my own kitchen and realized they'd already buried me in their minds. Not literally, not yet, but quietly, politely, as one buries things that embarrass. I'm 81 now. I live in the same 2-story house my late husband and I bought in 1973, on a street where the mailboxes all match and the roses are trimmed to military precision. The air smells of detergent and conformity. Everyone here waves without stopping. I used to belong to that rhythm, baking cookies for neighborhood fundraisers, clipping coupons, smiling at block parties where the wine was bad and the gossip worse. But time has a cruel way of making you invisible without ever asking if you're ready. When my husband died, the casseroles stopped after a week, and the calls from my children dwindled into scheduled check-ins, Sunday at 5, or whenever they remembered. They spoke to me as if I were a stubborn pet, difficult but dear. When I fell last winter and bruised my hip, my daughter said, "Mother, maybe it's time to think about what's best for you." I knew what she meant. A facility, a room with beige walls, and a call button that smelled of disinfectant. They called it a retirement community, but I know a euphemism when I hear one. I told her no. I told her I still woke up with a purpose, even if that purpose was just watering the spider plant that refused to die. She didn't argue, but the silence that followed had edges. I could feel her disappointment through the phone line, sharp and certain. It's strange, the way people talk about loneliness, as if it's something that happens to you, like the flu. But I think it's something you catch from others. Their fear of it seeps into you until you start believing you deserve it. The loneliness they imagined for me wasn't about solitude. It was punishment for aging out of their usefulness. They wanted me safe, which is to say silent, contained, off stage. But I was not ready to be packed away in some pastel room, waiting for visits that never came. I wanted noise, I wanted breath and conversation and something unpredictable. I wanted to remember what it felt like to belong in my own life. That realization didn't come dramatically. It came one Tuesday morning in April, after a storm had rattled the windows all night. I was drinking coffee at the kitchen table, staring at the rain streaks on the glass, and for a moment, the house looked like a photograph of itself, beautiful but empty. I'd inherited my mother's tendency toward quiet rebellion. She used to say, "If the world forgets you, make sure it regrets it later." I thought of her as I looked around at the too orderly kitchen, at the dining chairs that hadn't been touched since Christmas, and something inside me decided to misbehave. It began with an online advertisement, a simple post that said, "Room for rent. Mature homeowner seeks respectful tenant. Affordable rent. No nonsense." My hands shook as I typed it, not from fear, but from the absurdity of it all. I hadn't taken in a stranger since 1984, when my cousin's boy needed a place for 2 weeks and stayed 6 months. My daughter would be horrified if she knew. The neighbors would call it reckless, but the silence of the house was heavier than any risk. When I pressed post, the sound of the mouse click echoed like a gunshot. Then I laughed, long and low, because it was the first sound in weeks that had come from something alive. The replies came faster than I expected, dozens within a day. Some were obviously scams, some impolite, but one message stood out. A young man named Farid, 29, an engineering student who'd recently moved to the country. His words were neat, formal, cautious. He said he was quiet, didn't smoke, and would be grateful for a place near campus. There was a humility to the way he wrote, like someone who'd learned not to expect much kindness from the world. I liked that. I told him to come by Saturday at noon. That Friday night, I slept more deeply than I had in years. The next morning, I ironed the curtains, baked bread, and even swept the porch. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about preparing for change, something I'd stopped believing I was still capable of. When Farid arrived, he stood at the gate with a backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes wary but warm. His accent was soft, his smile careful. He called me Madam at first until I told him to stop, that I'd been called many things in life, but never that. He laughed then, and it was such a genuine sound that I felt the house exhale. That first afternoon, we sat at the kitchen table drinking tea. He told me about his mother, who still lived back home, and sent him photos of her cat every Sunday. I told him about my daughter, who called only on Sundays too, but never about cats. When he moved his things into the spare room, the air in the house changed, warmer somehow, less sterile. That night I heard the sound of him praying in the next room, low and rhythmic, and instead of feeling strange, it felt like company. When I told my daughter about the arrangement a week later, she went silent for a full 10 seconds before asking if I'd lost my mind. "You can't just rent your house to a stranger," she said. "You don't know who he is." I told her I didn't know who she was anymore either, and we ended the call. It wasn't cruelty, it was truth. That night, as I sat in the living room, I looked around and saw the house differently. The ticking clock didn't mock me. The walls no longer hummed with emptiness. A faint smell of cardamom drifted from the kitchen where Farid was cooking, and I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for anyone to remember me. I was already here, remembered by the world in small, ordinary ways. They said I'd die alone. Maybe I will someday. But if I do, it won't be in silence. And it won't be because I waited obediently for permission to live again. I didn't die when they expected me to fade. I began. And that, I think, is what frightened them most. It started with a phone call that pretended to be casual but carried the weight of an accusation. My daughter Clara called on a Thursday evening, her voice smooth, deliberate, as if rehearsed in advance. "Mother, I've been thinking," she began, and that alone told me I was in trouble. She only thought when there was a plan that required my compliance. "It's just that the house is so big, and you're alone most of the time. And, well, with everything in the news, break-ins, scams, it worries me." I could hear the faint clinking of her wine glass in the background, the slow exhale of someone who was about to deliver something unpleasant, but wanted to sound reasonable. "There's a lovely community outside of town," she said, "with staff on call and private rooms, not like those dreary old facilities." She said it as if she were selling a spa retreat. "They even have yoga classes and art therapy. You'd love it." I let her speak. I let her paint the picture of this new home where I'd supposedly flourish among watercolor sets and morning meditations. She talked about safety, about companionship, about the relief she'd feel knowing I was looked after. It was the politest way of saying she wanted me supervised, cataloged, put somewhere she could visit on holidays and then drive away from without guilt. I could almost see her sitting at her polished kitchen island, husband half listening, nodding along, both of them certain they were being kind. I told her I appreciated the suggestion, that I'd think about it. She seemed satisfied, not realizing that my words were smoke meant to hide the spark underneath. After we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the pale rectangle of the phone on the table. Outside, the wind was sharp enough to rattle the gutters, and the house felt alive with the hum of its own defiance. The next morning, a brochure arrived in the mail. She hadn't wasted any time. It was glossy, full of photographs of smiling seniors in coordinated cardigans, laughing around a jigsaw puzzle. Life in Harmony Hills, it read, in cheerful green font. I flipped through it slowly, amused and disgusted in equal measure. Every room looked the same, neutral, sterile, identical. Even the people seemed copied and pasted. There was a schedule of activities: water aerobics, movie nights, bingo, guided meditation. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. My daughter didn't even know that I hate swimming, and that bingo reminds me of funerals. She had no idea who I was, beyond the version of me she'd invented to justify her absence. The thought didn't make me cry. It made me angry, and anger, I've learned, is a wonderful fuel for clarity. Later that day, Fareed returned from his classes and found me in the garden, pruning dead branches from the hydrangea. He offered to help, and we worked in silence for a while until he said gently, "You seem troubled, Miss Marisol." I told him about the brochure, about the way my daughter's concern came wrapped in control. He didn't say much, just nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "In my country," he said after a while, "old people are the roots of the house. You don't move the roots. You take care of them where they stand." His words landed quietly but deeply, like a truth I'd forgotten I still believed. I smiled at him and said, "Then I suppose it's time to water the roots myself." The following week, I noticed a change in the neighborhood, subtle at first. Mrs. Harkins, the woman across the street who used to wave every morning, stopped. Mr. Leland, who walked his dog past my driveway every evening, began crossing to the other side. At the grocery store, I overheard two women whispering near the fruit display. "She's renting rooms, did you know?" "To foreigners," said the other, as if the word itself were a stain. It spread like mildew, this polite, poisonous curiosity. They didn't ask me directly. They just looked longer than necessary, as though I were a story unfolding in slow motion. One afternoon, a letter appeared in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name in tight, anxious handwriting. Inside was a printed notice from the Homeowners Association, written in the kind of officious language that reeks of small power. "Concerns have been raised regarding the occupancy and usage of your residence," it began. "Please ensure all tenants meet community guidelines." I laughed, but my hands trembled slightly. I wasn't breaking any laws, but the message was clear. I was breaking a social code. I was coloring outside their pale, manicured lines. Fareed saw the letter on the counter that evening and frowned. "Do you want me to speak to them?" he asked. "No," I said. "They wouldn't hear you anyway. It should have ended there, but gossip is a living thing. It feeds, grows, mutates." 2 weeks later, Clara called again. This time she didn't bother pretending it was concern. "Mother," she said, her voice clipped, "I've heard from several people that you're taking in strangers. Please tell me that isn't true." I could hear her pulse in the pause that followed, the panic of someone who believes reputation is more fragile than love. "You could get hurt," she added. "You don't know these people." I told her that maybe the problem wasn't that I didn't know them, but that I did, and they reminded me of the part of myself she's tried so hard to erase. She didn't understand. She rarely did. She raised her voice slightly, reminding me that the house was too large, that the neighborhood was not that kind of place, that my choices could cause complications. I said calmly, "It's my house, Clara." And she said the sentence that split the air in two. "Not for long, Mother." Then she hung up. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I sat on the edge of the kitchen chair, staring at the phone as if it might explain what she meant. Then I understood. The property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, I'd trusted her to handle the paperwork after my husband died. I had given her access, believing it would make things easier for everyone. My stomach turned cold. That night, I went through the file cabinet in the living room, the one that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco. And there it was, a recent letter from the bank addressed to her name, not mine, listing her as co-owner. My own daughter had quietly taken steps to make my autonomy temporary. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window watching the neighborhood lights blink off one by one, thinking about how betrayal often comes dressed as efficiency. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I called the bank, the lawyer who handled my husband's estate, and then, with trembling fingers, I called a local tenants' rights office. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about staying visible, staying in control, staying alive in a world that prefers women like me invisible and compliant. When Clara came by 2 days later, she found me on the porch with Farid and Eliza, the new tenant who had moved in that morning. Eliza was tall, elegant, her auburn hair tied back, her hands graceful even when still. Clara stopped short when she saw them. "Who are these people?" she asked, her tone hovering between fear and disdain. I smiled sweetly. "My tenants," I said. "My friends." She looked around, as though the very air were contaminated. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," she whispered, as if the word itself would shame me back into obedience. "No, Clara," I said softly. "For the first time, I'm simply making myself seen." That was the real betrayal. The moment she realized she no longer controlled the narrative. The mother she had relegated to memory had returned, not as a burden, but as a force, inconvenient and alive. She left soon after, muttering about lawyers and rights and safety, but I could see it in her face. It wasn't fear for me. It was fear of what I represented, an old woman who refused to vanish on schedule. That evening, the house was filled with the smell of lentils and butter and the sound of laughter. Eliza was tuning her small keyboard in the corner. Farid was teasing her gently about the way she hummed while she played, and I sat back in my chair watching the shadows dance across the walls. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum. It felt like a living organism, breathing again, its heart steady and defiant. I knew the battle was just beginning, that Clara would not let go easily, that the neighbors would find new ways to whisper. But the first move had been made, and it was mine. I thought again of my daughter's words, "Not for long, Mother." Maybe she was right. Maybe nothing lasts. But for now, the house was full of life, and the silence that once threatened to drown me had been replaced by something I hadn't heard in years. Belonging. It was fragile, imperfect, temporary, but it was real. And that reality, as brief as it might be, was mine to defend. It began quietly, the way storms always do, with small changes that didn't seem dangerous until they became impossible to ignore. For a while after Clara's visit, things settled into a kind of uneasy rhythm. Farid would leave for his morning classes with his backpack slung over one shoulder, always pausing by the door to say, "I'll bring milk," even if there was already plenty in the fridge. Eliza practiced piano in the afternoons, her music drifting through the house in soft, uneven waves, as though she was teaching the walls to breathe again. I would sit in the kitchen, reading the newspaper I no longer trusted, drinking coffee that grew cold before I remembered to finish it. Outwardly, it was peace, but there was something underneath, something like waiting or listening, as though the house itself could feel the tension gathering at the edges of our small miracle. One morning, I found an envelope slipped under the front door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with no signature, just 2 sentences typed in bold black ink. This neighborhood has standards. We expect you to respect them. I read it 3 times, not out of fear, but to savor the cowardice of it. Farid found me later sitting at the kitchen table with the letter beside my cup. Anonymous threats are the last refuge of small people, I said. He nodded, his jaw tightening. In my country, he replied, when people fear you, it means you've already won. I wanted to believe that. Still, something shifted after that. The mail began arriving later, sometimes opened, sometimes missing altogether. Once Eliza came home to find her car scratched down one side, a cruel line cut deep into the paint. We filed a police report, though I knew it wouldn't matter. The officer was polite but distracted, his questions perfunctory. You didn't see anyone? No. You don't have cameras? No. He nodded, wrote something in his pad, and promised to keep an eye out. I could tell he wouldn't. That night, Eliza sat on the porch smoking, her long fingers trembling slightly around the cigarette. They think I don't belong here, she said quietly. They think none of us do. I told her belonging is a myth invented by people who've never been exiled. She looked at me, surprised, then smiled. You talk like someone who's been through a war. Several, I said. Some I lost, some I escaped. The subtle hostilities grew bolder as summer thickened. Mrs. Harkins began leaving her trash bins directly in front of my driveway. Mr. Leland's dog barked every time Farid stepped outside. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store to find a note taped to my fence in neat feminine handwriting. Property values matter. Please reconsider your tenants. I tore it down slowly, folded it, and slipped it into my pocket like a souvenir of their cowardice. Farid suggested we ignore it. They want reaction, he said. Let them tire themselves. He was right, but patience had never been my strength. Every evening, as the sun sank behind the roofs, I could feel the neighborhood watching, its judgment thick as humidity. And yet, inside the house, something beautiful was happening. We had formed a strange, quiet community, a small nation of the unwanted. Farid cooked dinner twice a week, filling the kitchen with the scent of cumin and lemon. Eliza cleaned without being asked, humming low songs I didn't recognize. Sometimes they both joined me in the living room after dinner. We'd drink tea, tell half-truths about our pasts, laugh at things only survivors understand. I told them stories about my husband, about the summer he built the porch swing that still creaked like an old knee. They listened as though I were saying something important. In return, they told me pieces of their lives, Farid's father's disappointment, Eliza's estrangement from her brother. There was something raw and holy about it, the way we shared our fractures without pity. But peace, I've learned, is an invitation for disruption. It was a Tuesday morning when the first inspection notice arrived. The Homeowners Association had scheduled a routine property review for Friday. I knew what that meant. They were coming to search for fault, to find any excuse to declare my home non-compliant. I told Farid and Eliza not to worry, but inside I felt the old heat of anger rise again. The same heat I'd felt years ago when my husband's family tried to decide what kind of widow I should be. On Friday, 3 people arrived at my door, a man with too much cologne, a woman with a clipboard, and a younger man who introduced himself as a safety consultant. They smiled like dentists. The woman asked if my tenants were official. I said they were as official as my patience allowed. She didn't laugh. They walked through the rooms, making small noises of disapproval about the chipped paint on the windowsill, the slightly loose banister, the books stacked in the hallway. I followed them, silent, my arms crossed. When they finished, the man with the cologne said, "You'll receive the findings in writing." "Of course," I replied. "Be sure to spell my name right when you try to evict me." They didn't answer. That evening, as we sat together eating the stew Farid had made, I told them what had happened. Eliza reached across the table and took my hand. "They can't take your house," she said. I smiled sadly. "They can take anything if you don't look like you're willing to fight for it." Farid nodded slowly. "Then we fight," he said simply. The next day, I went to the local council office. The clerk behind the desk was a young woman with nervous energy and kind eyes. I explained my situation, showed her the letter, the notice, the unsigned complaints. She listened carefully and then said, "They can't force you to remove tenants if you're within zoning limits." She handed me a pamphlet about homeowners' rights. I thanked her, and when I stepped outside, the sunlight felt sharper, more honest. I realized how long it had been since I'd stood up for myself without trembling, but defiance has its cost. 2 days later, Clara appeared unannounced. She didn't knock. She walked straight in, calling my name like she owned the air in the house. I found her in the kitchen, her purse still dangling from her arm. "You've gone too far," she said. "People are talking. I had a call from Mr. Harkins. He said you're turning this place into some kind of boarding house." I leaned against the counter, letting her words wash over me. "They don't like change," I said. "They never did." She looked at me, her face red with frustration. "Mother, this isn't about them. It's about you. You're making a fool of yourself." I laughed then, softly, the kind of laugh that makes the other person nervous. If being alive makes me foolish, I'll stay foolish. She started to say something else, but Farid entered, polite as always, and offered her tea. She froze, uncertain whether to accept kindness from the man she feared. "No, thank you," she muttered, and left a few minutes later, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the china in the cabinet. That night, I sat on the porch alone. The street was quiet except for the hum of air conditioners and the occasional bark of a dog. I watched the sky darken and thought about the absurdity of it all, how something as simple as sharing space could unnerve an entire neighborhood. But maybe that was the point. Fear, I realized, was never about danger. It was about the collapse of certainty. And I had become their uncertainty. A week passed. The HOA's report arrived in a thick envelope. It listed violations, inadequate exterior maintenance, improper tenant registration, unauthorized structural modifications. I almost admired the creativity. At the bottom was a threat of fines if the issues weren't resolved within 30 days. I placed the letter on the table and called Clara. "You win," I said when she answered. "You can tell your friends the old woman has lost her mind." Then I hung up before she could respond. I wasn't giving her the satisfaction of pretending it was concern. That evening, I poured myself a glass of sherry and sat with Farid and Eliza on the porch. "What will you do?" Farid asked. I took a slow sip and smiled. "Exactly what they're afraid of," I said. The next morning I went to the courthouse and filed a formal appeal, requesting a hearing. It was tedious, bureaucratic, but it was also power. For the first time in years, I felt the thrill of resistance, not as nostalgia, but as muscle memory. I wasn't fighting just for a house. I was fighting for the right to define what home meant. When I came back, Eliza was watering the plants. She looked up, her face flushed from the sun. "You look taller," she said, and I realized she was right. Something had uncoiled inside me. That night, as I closed the curtains, I caught my reflection in the window, an old woman with tired eyes but a straight spine. I almost didn't recognize her, and maybe that was the point. The woman they pitied had vanished. In her place stood someone dangerous, someone alive enough to frighten them. The day the letter from the courthouse arrived, confirming my appeal date, the morning light seemed different, clearer, as if the house itself were breathing in with me. It was a thin envelope, government gray, nothing dramatic, yet it felt heavier than anything I had held in a long time. I placed it on the kitchen table beside my cup of tea and stared at it for several minutes before opening it. The hearing was scheduled for the following month downtown, in a small administrative court where people went to argue about fences, tree roots, and zoning ordinances. Hardly the stuff of legend, but for me, it felt like a battlefield. I realized as I folded the paper neatly and slid it under a magnet on the fridge that I had crossed an invisible threshold. I was no longer reacting. I was deciding. I wasn't a cornered widow clutching the remnants of a life. I was an active participant in its reconstruction, and that awareness, though quiet, was revolutionary. In the weeks that followed, the house settled into a new rhythm, the kind that emerges when people begin to trust one another beyond politeness. Fareed started cooking in larger quantities, leaving containers of rice and stew in the fridge with my name written on tape across the lid. Eliza, who had been cautious at first, began leaving her door open while she practiced piano, letting the music spill freely through the hallway. I found myself lingering near the sound, pretending to dust the shelves just to listen to her fingers find their way through melodies she hadn't mastered yet. She told me once that she played because it reminded her she still existed beyond her body, beyond the way people stared at her in grocery stores. I told her I understood. She looked at me then, surprised but not skeptical, and said softly, "You really do, don't you?" I nodded. There was no need to explain that being old in this country is just another kind of exile. I started walking again, early in the mornings before the heat became unbearable. The streets were mostly empty, except for delivery trucks and the occasional jogger. I liked the quiet defiance of being visible, of making the neighbors see that I was still there, still walking, still unbent. Sometimes I would stop by the small park 2 blocks over and sit on the bench under the maple tree. Children played there after school, and I found comfort in their noise, their disregard for categories. They didn't care who belonged where. They just wanted someone to push the swing. Once, a little girl with a missing front tooth sat beside me and said, "You smell like bread." I laughed. "That's not a bad thing," she added, and skipped away. I carried that with me the whole day, a reminder that innocence has a way of cutting through the rot of prejudice. Inside the house, there were moments that felt almost domestic. Fareed would come home late, drop his keys in the bowl by the door, and collapse on the couch, muttering about professors who treated him like a statistic. Eliza would appear from her room with 2 mugs of tea, handing him one wordlessly, and I'd sit across from them, watching the small ritual unfold with the quiet pride of a matriarch who'd built something no one else could see. Once, Fareed said, "You know, Miss Marisol, this house, it's different. It feels like it listens." I smiled, remembering my husband sanding the floorboards himself, saying the same thing 50 years ago. The walls, he'd told me, would hold our stories if we were careful with them. And they had, even the ugly ones. Now they were learning new ones, and it felt right. Still, not everything was peace. The tension outside continued like a low hum beneath the surface. I'd catch sight of cars slowing down in front of the house, drivers peering in as if to confirm the rumors. One afternoon, a delivery man refused to hand me my package until I produced identification. "We've had reports," he said vaguely. Reports of what? He didn't say. I handed him my ID with shaking hands, not from fear but from rage barely contained. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table until my pulse steadied, then opened the package. It was a second-hand camera I had ordered online. That evening, I installed it above the front door, not to prove anything to them, but to remind myself that I could still take action. When the first rent payments came due, both Fareed and Eliza tried to give me extra money, saying they wanted to help with the legal costs. I refused. "You're paying enough," I said. "I'm not running a charity, and I'm not taking one either." But Fareed slipped an envelope into the cookie jar anyway, and when I found it later, I didn't return it. I used it to buy a new dress for the hearing, a navy blue one with long sleeves, simple but dignified. I hadn't bought new clothes in years. When I tried it on in front of the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes sharp, her face lined not with defeat, but with experience. For the first time in a long while, I looked like someone who could not be dismissed. A few nights before the hearing, Eliza suggested we host a small dinner. To celebrate, she said. Whatever happens, we should mark the change. We cooked together, all three of us, the kitchen filled with overlapping sounds, the hiss of the pan, the soft hum of Eliza's music, Fareed reciting lines from some poet he loved. We ate on the porch, under the string lights I had found in the attic, talking long into the night. It was there, amid laughter and shared food, that I realized the shift inside me was complete. I was no longer guarding the ruins of my old life. I was building a new one, brick by humble brick. When the day of the hearing arrived, the sky was an unbroken blue, almost mocking in its perfection. Fareed insisted on driving me downtown. I wanted to refuse, to maintain my independence, but there was something in his voice that reminded me of my son when he was still kind. We parked in front of the courthouse, a squat concrete building that smelled faintly of bureaucracy and stale coffee. Inside, the clerk guided us to a narrow hallway lined with benches. People milled about, clutching folders and sighing. I felt oddly calm. When my name was called, I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked into the small courtroom. The HOA representative was there, the same man with too much cologne, seated beside a woman with sharp glasses and sharper cheekbones. The hearing officer was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who looked as though she'd seen every variety of human pettiness. She asked for statements, documents, clarifications. I answered every question with precision, my voice steady, my hands unmoving. When the HOA claimed my tenants were unauthorized, I presented the law stating otherwise. When they complained about property values, I asked how compassion depreciated real estate. The officer smiled faintly at that. After 40 minutes, it was over. The decision would be mailed, she said. As I stood to leave, the man with the cologne muttered under his breath, "You people always think you're special." I turned to him slowly and said, "I don't think. I know." Fareed and I walked out into the sunlight without speaking. In the car, he reached for the radio, then hesitated. "You were magnificent," he said. I smiled. So was the law for once. That evening, I sat on the porch again, the air heavy with the scent of rain. The neighbors' lights flickered on one by one, But I didn't look away this time. I watched them openly, daring them to meet my gaze. None did. Inside, Eliza played a slow, mournful tune on the piano, the notes spilling through the screen door. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt the quiet not as absence, but as fullness. Whatever the outcome of the hearing, I knew I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The woman who had waited politely for her children's approval was gone. In her place was someone fierce in her ordinariness, someone who had discovered that resistance doesn't always roar. It often sounds like the steady clinking of dishes after dinner, the rhythm of footsteps on an old wooden floor, the laughter of people others call strangers, but who have become your family. That night, before I went to bed, I stood by the window and looked at the faint reflection of my own face against the dark glass. I whispered, "You did it," not as praise, but as confirmation. The house, as if listening, creaked softly in response. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, promising rain, and I thought, let it come. I wasn't afraid of storms anymore. The decision came in an envelope without ceremony, slipped into my mailbox on a Wednesday morning when the air already felt too warm for spring. I had been watering the small patch of herbs Farid planted by the porch when I noticed the official seal stamped in blue. My hand shook slightly as I opened it, not from fear, but from the strange weight of expectation, that thin line between hope and resignation that older women learn to balance on like tightrope walkers. The letter was short, almost curt. Upon review, the court finds no evidence of zoning violations. The homeowner is within her rights to maintain tenants. All fines rescinded. That was it. No apology, no recognition, just an acknowledgement that I had been right all along. Yet when I finished reading it, I felt a sudden, hot rush of something that wasn't joy, but release, like a knot inside me finally coming undone. For a few seconds, I stood there, the letter trembling in my hand, the sun flashing on the white paper like a signal flare. Then I began to laugh, a deep sound that startled the birds off the fence. I went inside, placed the letter on the table, and poured myself a glass of cold water. It was over, I thought. But of course it never really is. Farid and Eliza celebrated that evening as if we had won a war. Eliza baked a cake from a recipe she had learned as a child, dense and sweet with cinnamon. Farid brought home a cheap bottle of wine and opened it with exaggerated ceremony. We sat around the table, the three of us, raising our mismatched glasses in a toast that felt both triumphant and defiant. To peace, Farid said. To persistence, Eliza added. I raised mine last and said simply, to ownership, not of things, but of ourselves. They smiled, and for a while we were just three people sharing air and laughter, bound not by obligation, but by the quiet knowledge of what it means to be dismissed, and to survive anyway. Later that night, when they had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the shadows moving across the walls. I should have felt safe, but instead there was a thin thread of unease twisting through me, the knowledge that victory doesn't end hostility. It sharpens it. I could almost hear the neighborhood exhaling in disapproval, their whispered resentment gathering behind closed curtains. A few days later, my suspicion proved right. Someone slashed Farid's bicycle tires during the night, the rubber left hanging in ragged strips. He found it in the morning and carried the bike up the porch steps, his face pale with restrained fury. It's all right, I told him. We'll replace them. But I could tell it wasn't about the tires. It was about the message. You don't belong here. I saw that same message painted, quite literally, 2 nights later. When I stepped outside early the next morning, There was graffiti on my fence, a crude smear of red spray paint forming a word I won't repeat, one aimed at Eliza. I stood there for a long moment, the garden hose slack in my hand, the water pooling around my shoes. The cruelty of it wasn't shocking. What shocked me was how predictable it had become. Farid appeared beside me, silent, holding a rag and a bucket. We scrubbed it together until the wood was raw and pale again. Neither of us spoke, but the silence between us was thick with shared exhaustion. That afternoon, Clara called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity is a stubborn habit. Her voice was tight, defensive, like someone already rehearsing her side of a story. I saw the pictures, she said. Someone posted them in the neighborhood group. Mother, this has gone too far. I asked her what exactly had gone too far. People renting rooms or people hating them for it? She ignored the question, switching to her usual tone of managerial concern. You can't live like this, she said. You're making yourself a target. I told her that targets at least get noticed, which is more than I could say for invisible women. She sighed, a long theatrical sound. You're impossible. And you're predictable, I replied, and hung up before she could reply. I stood there afterward, the phone warm against my palm, feeling both liberated and lonely in the same heartbeat. It's a strange truth of defiance. The higher you stand, the fewer people stand with you. The next week, I began receiving phone calls late at night. At first, I thought they were wrong numbers. Silence on the other end, then a click. But on the third night, a voice spoke. A man's unfamiliar, deliberately casual. You think you're brave, he said, but people like you always end up needing help. Then the line went dead. I sat there staring at the phone, the words replaying in my mind until they lost meaning. I didn't tell Farid or Eliza. They already carried enough of the burden. Instead, I wrote the date and time of each call on a notepad I kept by the phone, a habit from my working years when documentation was its own armor. Every act of cruelty, I decided, would leave a paper trail, even if no one else ever read it. One evening, not long after, Eliza came home, visibly shaken. She had been followed from the bus stop, she said, by a man in a silver car who slowed down each time she turned a corner. He didn't say anything, she told me, but he didn't need to. Farid insisted on walking her to and from work after that, but I could see the fear sitting on her shoulders like a weight. Watching them, I felt an ache so deep it surprised me. I had invited them into my home to fight my loneliness, not to inherit my battles. Yet here they were, my allies by choice, enduring a hostility I had spent a lifetime avoiding through politeness. I wondered then whether rebellion at my age was bravery or selfishness. The situation escalated further the following week when I received a formal letter from a law firm in the city. It was printed on expensive paper, the kind meant to intimidate. It accused me of endangering community welfare through unlawful rental activity and threatened civil action on behalf of concerned neighbors. There was no signature, only the firm's name, but I didn't need one to know who was behind it. Clara. I called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, her tone falsely calm. Mother, I was going to call you, she began. I cut her off. Don't, I said. You've done enough. There was a pause, then her voice hardened. I'm trying to protect you. You don't understand what people are saying. I understand perfectly, I said. They're saying I don't know my place, and you're helping them keep me there. For the first time, she didn't have a response. She hung up quietly, and in that silence, I heard the last thread between us snap. That night, rain came hard, pounding against the roof like fists. Fareed and Eliza were both home, and we sat together in the living room, listening to the storm. The power flickered, then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. For a moment, I felt the old fear rise, that animal terror of being small and unseen in a world that wishes you gone. But then Fareed lit a candle, and Eliza began humming softly. The sound was low, steady, human. I looked at their faces in the flickering light and thought, this is what home is. Not safety, not approval, but presence, people staying even when it's hard. When the lights finally came back, I made tea, and we drank it without speaking. The next morning, the lawyer himself came to the door, a thin man in a dark suit holding a briefcase like a weapon. Mrs. Alvarez, he said, his voice oily with practiced civility. I represent several residents of this community, including your daughter, who are concerned about your well-being and your recent associations. I let him finish his little speech, then opened the screen door fully and said, my well-being doesn't require witnesses, and my associations don't require your permission. He blinked, unused to being interrupted. This could get unpleasant, he warned. It already is, I said, and shut the door in his face. I stood there for a moment afterward, my heart pounding but steady. When I turned around, Fareed was standing in the hallway, watching me. You didn't have to do that alone, he said. I did, I replied. Otherwise, they'll never stop treating me like someone who needs saving. That evening, I wrote a letter of my own, brief, formal, signed in black ink. I sent it to the law firm, stating that any further contact would be considered harassment and that I had retained counsel of my own. I hadn't yet, but I would. I made copies of everything and placed them in a folder labeled Freedom. It sat on my desk, a tangible reminder that the fight had boundaries and that I was still the one drawing them. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the noise outside began to quiet. Maybe they grew tired, or maybe they realized I wasn't going to break. The graffiti stopped. The phone calls ended. The silence that replaced them was tense but tolerable. The silence of a truce neither side had declared. Clara didn't call again. I saw her once, from a distance, standing by her car at the end of the street, pretending to check her phone while sneaking glances toward the house. I didn't wave. I didn't owe her recognition. Then, just as I began to believe the worst had passed, an article appeared in the local newspaper. Elderly homeowner draws concern over questionable tenants. It quoted sources close to the family who claimed I was being manipulated, exploited, possibly suffering cognitive decline. There was even a photograph, me in the garden, taken without my knowledge. I stared at it for a long time, the image of myself so familiar, yet strange, a small figure bending toward the soil, hair caught by the wind, expression unreadable. Fareed and Eliza read the article too. Fareed swore softly under his breath. Eliza took my hand. They're scared, she said. Because you're showing them what freedom looks like. I wanted to believe that, but all I could feel was the sting of betrayal layered on top of exhaustion. That night I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the little marks of my husband's life still etched into the wood. Everything we had built together, all the years of quiet labor, had become a battleground. I stood by the window watching the streetlights flicker, and for the first time, I didn't see enemies out there. I saw ghosts of my own past obedience, the decades I'd spent asking for permission to exist. I realized then that the fight was no longer about the neighborhood or even Clara. It was about something older, deeper, the lifelong conditioning that teaches women to shrink, to smooth over conflict, to be grateful for what little space they're given. And I thought, not anymore. The next morning, I walked to the bank. The teller, a young woman with bright purple nails, smiled as she greeted me. I handed her a form I had filled out at home, a transfer of a portion of my savings into a joint account with Fareed and Eliza. "You sure about this?" she asked. "Completely," I said. It wasn't charity, it was trust, a deliberate redistribution of my loyalty. When I left the bank, the sky was clear, the air bright with possibility. For the first time in years, I felt unburdened. When I got home, I found Fareed painting the porch railing, his face streaked with white. "Looks like new," I said. "That's the point," he replied with a grin. Inside, Eliza was baking again, her voice rising softly with a song I didn't know. I stood there in the doorway, the sound of their laughter drifting through the air, and I thought, maybe this is how revolutions end, not with banners or applause, but with the quiet reclamation of an ordinary life. Yet even as peace settled back over the house, I knew better than to believe it was permanent. Freedom isn't a state. It's an ongoing act, a decision renewed every morning. I understood that now. I also understood that I would never go back, not to obedience, not to silence, not to the shrinking version of myself that once waited for someone else to define home. I had found it, imperfect and fragile, inside these walls filled with strangers who had become family. Whatever came next, letters, lawsuits, gossip, I was ready. Because the truth is, they hadn't taught me fear. They'd reminded me how much I could endure. And that endurance, hard-earned and unyielding, was mine alone. It happened on a Sunday morning that began like any other, quiet and slow, sunlight leaking through the curtains in soft ribbons. I was sitting at the kitchen table, spreading marmalade on toast, when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me. No one visited unannounced anymore. Fareed was at work, Eliza still asleep. When I opened the door, there were two men standing on the porch, both in crisp suits, one holding a folder, the other with a badge clipped to his belt. "Mrs. Alvarez?" the older one asked, his tone formal but rehearsed. I nodded, and he continued, "We're here on behalf of the Department of Adult Protective Services. We receive reports regarding your well-being and possible financial exploitation." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The phrase hung in the air like a foul odor. "You must be mistaken," I said. "I haven't reported anything." The younger man shifted uncomfortably. "The reports came from a family member, ma'am. We just need to verify a few things." I didn't have to ask who had made the call. Clara had finally escalated her crusade from manipulation to intervention. I stepped aside and let them in, my body moving before my mind could catch up. The house was clean, bright, alive with the faint scent of Eliza's lavender candles. The older man looked around slowly, his eyes scanning the photographs on the walls, the neatly stacked books, the kitchen counter with 3 mugs drying on a towel. "Do you live here alone?" he asked. I smiled. Clearly not. He frowned, scribbling something in his notes. The younger man looked nervous, as if he hated his job. "We just need to confirm that you're safe," he said gently. "We've had cases where seniors were pressured to share property or finances under duress." I could feel the anger rising like heat under my skin. I wanted to shout, to tell them how absurd it was, how insulting. But I kept my voice calm, controlled. "Would you like to see my bank statements?" I asked. "My will? My tax returns? Perhaps a cognitive test while we're at it?" The older one shifted, uncertain whether I was mocking him. "We're not accusing you of anything," he said stiffly. "We're protecting you." That word again. Protection. the polite cage they build around women when they fear our decisions. Eliza came into the room then, her hair still damp from the shower, wearing a loose robe. She froze when she saw the men. "What's going on?" she asked. The younger one glanced at her, eyes flicking to the painted nails, the faint trace of makeup, and I could almost see the judgment forming in his mind. "We're conducting a welfare check," he said. She laughed, a sharp sound. "On whom? Because she's taking care of us more than we of her." Fareed arrived minutes later, breathless, having received a call from Eliza. He walked in with his usual calm, but his jaw was tight. "This is harassment," he said quietly. "You have no right to question her like this without cause." The older man turned to him. "And you are?" "Her tenant," Fareed replied, "and friend." The agent nodded, his tone shifting colder. "We've had complaints about unauthorized occupants." I could feel the room tightening, the air itself drawing in. I stood then, straightened my back, and said, "Enough." The word came out sharper than I intended, slicing through their bureaucratic politeness. "You have 5 minutes to ask your questions, and then you leave." They stayed for 30, of course. They checked documents, asked me to describe how I managed bills, whether I took medication, whether anyone assisted me with finances. I answered every question clearly, deliberately, refusing to give them even a hint of frailty. When they finally left, I closed the door quietly and leaned against it, my hands trembling. Fareed reached out, but I waved him away. "I'm fine," I said, though the truth was more complicated. I wasn't fine. I was humiliated, furious, exhausted. The invasion wasn't about safety. It was about control, about reminding me that even when you win, they can still find new ways to make you justify your freedom. That evening, Clara called. I didn't answer, but she left a voicemail. Her voice was calm, falsely gentle. "Mother, I'm worried about you. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. Please understand. I'm only doing what's best." I deleted it halfway through. There are words so poisoned by hypocrisy that even hearing them contaminates the air. I went to the porch and sat there until the sun began to set. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. Curtains fluttered slightly as I looked around. I knew they were watching, waiting for the spectacle to resume. I imagined them whispering to each other over dinner. "Poor thing, she's lost her mind," never realizing that madness, if it meant living on my own terms, might be the sanest thing I'd ever done. The next day, I decided to act, not react, act. I called my lawyer, the one I'd met briefly after the HOA hearing, and asked her to come by. Her name was Miriam, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority like armor. When she arrived, I explained everything: the visit, the calls, the article, the unending campaign of concern. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in a neat, efficient hand. When I finished, she looked up and said, "You have grounds for legal recourse: harassment, defamation, potential abuse of guardianship claims. If they want to challenge your capacity, we'll give them evidence of your strength instead." I felt a sudden surge of relief, not because of her confidence, but because she spoke to me as an equal, not a patient. Together, we drafted a document that afternoon, an amendment to my will, transferring ownership of the house into a living trust co-managed by myself, Fareed, and Eliza, ensuring that no one, not even my family, could sell or claim it without our collective consent. Miriam watched me sign it, her expression softening. "You know this will make waves," she said. "Good," I replied. "Let them drown in them." When the papers were notarized and filed, I felt a calm unlike anything I had known in years. It wasn't triumph or vengeance. It was liberation distilled into ink and legality. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. The following morning, I called Clara. She answered, her tone clipped. "Mother, I was about to—" I interrupted her gently. "I've taken care of everything," I said. "The house, the finances, my well-being. You don't need to worry about me anymore." There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "What do you mean taken care of?" I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "I mean that from now on, your concern is no longer required, nor is your permission." I could almost hear her pulse through the silence. "You've lost your mind," she hissed finally. "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine to lose." Then I hung up. Word spread quickly, of course. Within days, the neighbors knew. There were more stares, a few snide comments, a note left in the mailbox that said, "You're a disgrace." I pinned it to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. A souvenir, I told Eliza when she saw it. She laughed until she cried. Farid looked worried. "They won't stop," he said quietly. "Then neither will I replied. 2 weeks later, the HOA held its monthly meeting at the community center, and for the first time in years, I decided to attend. I wore the same navy dress from the hearing, ironed perfectly, my hair neatly pinned. Farid and Eliza came with me despite my protests. The room was full, the air thick with the scent of disinfectant and disapproval. The president of the HOA, a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, cleared her throat as I entered, her smile brittle. "Mrs. Alvarez," she said, "this is unexpected." "Most things worth doing are," I replied, and took a seat at the front. When it was time for open discussion, I stood. My hands didn't shake. "For months," I began, "this community has treated my home as a threat, my tenants as invaders, and my independence as madness. You've called authorities, spread rumors, vandalized property, and justified it all in the name of safety and decency. But what you fear isn't danger, it's difference." The room rustled with discomfort. "You preach values, but what you mean is conformity. You claim to protect families, yet you destroy the ones that don't look like yours. I've lived here 40 years, paid my dues, buried my husband under this soil, and watched this place turn into a mirror that reflects only fear." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm demanding your memory. Remember that once an old woman stood here and refused to vanish quietly." For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone began to clap, Eliza, her palms steady and proud. Farid joined her, his applause echoing through the sterile room. A few others followed, hesitant but sincere. Mrs. Caldwell looked flustered, her composure cracking under the weight of exposure. "This isn't appropriate," she stammered. I smiled. "Neither is prejudice." Then I turned and walked out, the sound of scattered applause following me into the night air. Outside, the sky was streaked with violet, the first stars trembling above the roofs. Farid walked beside me, silent, while Eliza hummed softly under her breath. The air felt different, lighter, cleansed. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I was walking toward it, toward the life I had built deliberately, defiantly, without permission. When we reached the house, I stood for a long moment on the porch, looking at the windows glowing warmly from within. My home, imperfect and alive, no longer a place of retreat but a declaration. I turned to them and said, "Let's eat." Inside, the table waited, the candles ready to be lit, and as I stepped through the door, I realized that the fight was over, but the freedom was just beginning. The days that followed moved with a strange gentleness, as if time itself had finally loosened its grip on me. There were no more letters, no more visits, no more calls, pretending to be concerned. The silence that replaced them was not oppressive but full, layered with the ordinary sounds of living, the kettle's whistle in the morning, the distant hum of traffic, the faint laughter of Eliza and Fareed drifting through the house like music from another room. I had imagined peace as something dramatic, a curtain falling after a long performance. But it wasn't that. It was quieter, humbler, the slow settling of dust after a storm. I woke up earlier now, not because of anxiety, but because I wanted to witness the light entering the house, soft and golden, the way it used to when my husband was alive. Sometimes I would sit at the kitchen table with my tea and feel the air itself exhale, as if the walls were relieved too. The house no longer carried tension. It breathed with us, steady and unhurried. Fareed finished his studies that summer. I helped him prepare for his final presentation, sitting across from him as he practiced his speech, correcting his pronunciation gently, admiring the precision in his hands as he gestured. When he received his diploma, he brought it home wrapped in brown paper and laid it on the dining table like an offering. "You made this possible," he told me, and I laughed, shaking my head. "No," I said, "you made it inevitable." Eliza, meanwhile, started giving piano lessons to the children of the neighborhood, and little by little, the same people who had once glared at her began to smile in passing. I would watch the mothers drop off their children, their eyes curious but softened by gratitude when they came to collect them later, the sound of hesitant scales following them down the street. One afternoon, I overheard Mrs. Harkins, the same woman who had once left notes on my fence, telling another neighbor that Eliza was quite talented and that it was nice to hear music again. I didn't say anything, but when I went back inside, I laughed so hard I had to hold the edge of the counter to steady myself. Clara did not come around. Months passed before I heard her voice again. It was November, the air cold and clean, when the phone rang one evening as I was arranging flowers on the table. Her tone was cautious, stripped of authority. "Mother," she said, "I wanted to wish you a happy birthday." I could hear in her voice that she had rehearsed the words. "Thank you," I replied. "I'm 79 now, you know." 81, she corrected automatically, then stopped, realizing the absurdity of it. There was a long pause, the kind that sits between people who have too much history and not enough forgiveness. Finally, she said softly, "I'm sorry." It was not the grand apology I had once imagined, not the confession or acknowledgement I had built speeches for in my mind. It was small, hesitant, but real. "So am I," I said, and that was enough. We spoke for a few minutes about simple things: the weather, her son's new job, a recipe I used to make when she was little. When we hung up, I didn't cry. I just stood there, the phone warm against my cheek, grateful for the ordinariness of it, for the way love sometimes returns not as fire, but as ember, quiet but alive. Winter arrived softly that year. Fareed went home to visit his family, promising to return in the spring, and Eliza stayed, keeping the house filled with her piano and her stories. On cold nights, she and I would sit by the fire, knitting scarves we didn't need, talking about everything and nothing. She told me once that she had never known a place where she could simply exist without being questioned. I told her that had been my wish too, though it had taken me a lifetime to grant it to myself. We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that feels companionable, the kind that needs no apology. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, but inside the air was warm and steady. On the first day of the new year, I walked through each room of the house as I did every January, touching the furniture, opening the windows briefly to let in the cold. It was a ritual I had kept since my husband's death, a way to remind myself that life still moved through these walls. This time, though, it felt different. The rooms no longer echoed with absence. They held presence. The photographs on the shelves, my children as toddlers, my husband smiling in his suit, even the one of me at 21, eyes full of hope, seemed less like relics and more like witnesses, proof of a life lived in all its stubbornness and grace. When I reached the piano, I ran my fingers lightly across the keys, though I couldn't play. A single note rang out, high and trembling, and I smiled at its imperfection. It was enough. Sometimes when I sit on the porch in the late afternoons, I see people walking by who used to cross the street to avoid my house. Now they nod politely. Some even wave. I wave back, not out of forgiveness, but out of understanding. Fear ages faster than any of us. Perhaps theirs has simply grown tired. I have learned that peace doesn't mean winning over your enemies. It means no longer needing to. The garden Farid planted flourishes, even in the cold, stubbornly green against the pale winter sky. I water it less often now, trusting it to survive on its own. That, too, feels symbolic. At night, before I sleep, I often think about my mother and the words she once told me. If the world forgets you, make sure it regrets it later. For years, I thought she meant rebellion, but now I understand she meant remembrance, not of others. Remembering you, but of you remembering yourself. I have done that. I have remembered the woman I was before fear took her voice, before the weight of being acceptable pressed her into silence. I am not perfect, not healed, not young, but I am here, still choosing, still unafraid of being seen. And if someday I do die alone, as they once predicted, it will not be a tragedy. It will be an ending in a house filled with echoes of laughter, of arguments, of music, of courage. The walls will remember the sound of defiance wrapped in tenderness, the way a piano note lingers after the player lifts her hand. Maybe someone will find the papers I've kept, the folder labeled freedom, the letters never sent, the will that bears 3 names instead of 1, and they'll understand that what I built here wasn't rebellion, but belonging. The porch creaks beneath me as I sit here now, the sky melting into evening, the air smelling faintly of rain. Eliza's music drifts through the open window, and somewhere inside, the kettle begins to hum. I close my eyes and listen. The house is alive, the world still spinning, and for the first time in my long, complicated life, I feel entirely at home within it. If there's any message left in me for the women who come after, it's this: do not wait to be saved. Open the door yourself, even if your hands tremble. Let in whoever brings light. Call them family if you wish, or simply call them company. Either way, you will have lived. And living, I have learned, is the most radical thing of all.